My name is John Pasfield, and the title of this reading will be The Poetic Novel 1, Video 9, Maynard, Mack. This is my book, The Poetic Novel 1, Influences and Elements by John Pasfield. Now, it's not a published book, but can be accessed for free on my website, johnpasfield.ca. That's all one word. I'm going to read from a chapter in the book in which I discuss the contribution to my career as a fiction writer by the critic Maynard Mack. So this is note 9 in the book, Maynard Mack. This has been an interesting discovery. For 50 years, from 1967 to 2017, excuse me, I've been thinking and writing about the implications for the generation of meaning by imagery of the phrase umbrella imagery, which I have referred to in many of my notebooks and journals. I remember that I had first read this phrase in an essay in the back of a copy of a Shakespeare play. But since the only image that stuck in my mind as an example of the term umbrella imagery was from Macbeth, I had never found the essay and the author in my own copies of that Shakespeare play. But yesterday, this is 2017, 5-6 years ago, yesterday it occurred to me that the essay might be in a play, which is not Macbeth. And sure enough, I found the essay on my bookshelf in a signet edition of Othello dated January 1967, when I was 21 years old. Well, I'm now 77 years old. Now, here is the book, Othello. It's an essay in the back of that book, which was on my shelf all those years. The author is Maynard Mack, and the essay is The Jacobean Shakespeare, Some Observations on the Construction of the Tragedies. That's the kind of thing I used to read at 21 years old. The brand new paper book sold at that time for 50 cents. So try buying a brand new paperback for 50 cents in the year 2023, which is when I'm reading this. There's much more in the essay than I remembered, of course, but I would cite Maynard Mack's phrase, umbrella imagery, as one of those seminal items of criticism which awakened a concern in me as to how imagery works to generate meaning. This concern triggered a 50-year idea quest, which has dominated both my reading and my writing. This phrase was one of the first indications that I had that literary forms are elastic and can be made to convey the complexities of the human mind. So how to write books that, as technical objects, reflect the way our minds work as humans. That was the challenge. That is the challenge still. Here's a quote from Maynard Mack. There's a kind of construction in Shakespeare's tragedies which is inward. So how to write books that sort of capture the inner thinking of people as we go through our lives. Here's my response to that quote. One of the most intriguing aspects of drama is that it's probably the most outward means of writing about life in the lexicon of literary genres. At a glance, there seems to be no author and certainly no narrator. On the stage, the characters speak to one another. On the page of a printed play, the reader encounters only the dialogue that the characters speak to one another. So how do we as readers experience two things? But I'll number them. Number one, a sense of the inner life of the character, and two, a sense of the thoughts of the author. So if all you see is the outside of people, and all you hear is their words, how do you know what the character's thinking inside their head? How do you know what the author's thinking? What Maynard Mack is concerned with here is what I've always attributed to Una Ellis Fermer, as a critic who caused me to think about these questions as they apply to the various genres of literature. Mack, too, is aware that there are limits to what a traditional version of a genre can do, the limitations of drama, in Ellis Fermer's phrase, and that some writers, notably Shakespeare, feel those limitations, whether consciously or subconsciously, and seek ways to overcome those limitations in the presentation of their life views and writing their objective correlatives, that's a T.S. Eliot phrase, image patterns in the dramatic mode. So how do you put more into a play or a novel or a poem than it's designed to contain? A novel is a container. There's some things that won't hold. Well, what do? A play is a container. There's some things that won't hold. So the technical poetic means of presenting the inner experience of a main character in a traditionally and conceptually outer experience genre, the play, is what seems most interesting to Maynard, Mack to study and to explore. How did Shakespeare get these things into a genre, the play, which isn't designed to contain them? Okay, section number 3 is a quotation again from Maynard Mack from his essay. The situation is so arranged by Shakespeare that we are invited to apply the fool's comments to Lear's inner experience. The fool thus serves to some extent as a screen on which Shakespeare flashes, as it were, readings from the psychic life of the protagonist, King Lear, possibly even his subconscious life, which cannot otherwise be conveyed in drama at all. So how do you get the inner ideas of one character onto the stage while you put them in the mouth of another character, says Maynard Mack. Mack points out that the fool in King Lear is much more limited in his interest than is the king, and therefore much more focused on certain topics and motifs. Mack proposes that the comments of the fool, his paradoxes and riddles, are not only the concerns of a separate corporeal character, King Lear, who appears on the stage, but can also be seen as Shakespeare's means of conveying to the viewer of the play what is also a cause for concern at some level of thought in the king's mind. This is fascinating to me, not only for what it suggests about a main character who does not explain his inner thoughts in stage words, but for what it suggests about the nature of literature as it can be written and as it can be read. For those who prefer a prose novel in which a reader is kept constantly aware, either by an authorial voice or by the voice of a narrator, of what a main character is thinking as he or she goes through a process, could be from ignorance to wisdom, from lack of compassion to compassion, and so on, Shakespeare's way of presenting character might be alarming. Alarming because the questions which such a reader might ask of the Shakespearean presentation of a novel are, here are 3 points, I'll number them. Number 1, how do we know what the main character is thinking, both during the process and at the end of the process? Number 2, do we even know whether the process is taking place or at the end has taken place? Number 3, how do we know what the author is thinking in terms of the meaning of such a novel? Well, the answer is that we don't know. We can only speculate. We can only read the poetic novel as if we are the main character, or as if we are the author, and speculate as to what we would mean by the use and patterning of such images. So, 2 more points. Number 1, the choices of the author, Shakespeare, for this essay, of genre, of the adjustment of the limits for the genre, and 2, the assumptions of the author as to the relationship between his own sense of meaning and the viewer-reader's speculative meaning are far different from the choices and assumptions of the authors of explanatory literary presentations. Well, I'll stop reading here, but if you're interested in the creation and use of literary conventions in order to convey to a reader the complexity of the lives that we all live here on Earth, you can read the complete essay at my website, as I mentioned before, johnpassfield.ca. I'll confine myself to reading the conclusion which I wrote at that time. So, okay, now, leaving out a whole lot of that essay, I leap to the conclusion of that essay. No doubt these quotations, both by the selection and the trimming, have served my purposes rather than Maynard Mack's, but that is the point. We are influenced not by other people's ideas, but what we think are those people's ideas, or what we think of when we are stimulated by those people's ideas. It's been the interplay of my reading of the fiction that I've been drawn to, and whose meaning and methods of generation of meaning was much beyond me, and my reading of the criticism to which I've always been drawn, only parts of which made sense to me, but all of which entered my mind and resonated with other ideas about fiction and fictional theory, that have led me to feel the need for and develop the kind of novel, the poetic novel, which I am now writing. though his name was lost to me until yesterday. That was yesterday in 2017, 5 years ago. Maynard Mack, through the haunting concept of the umbrella speech and drama, was one of those who set me off on what I can now see as a 50-year, it's now 55-year mental journey in search of what I originally assumed was the poetic play, and now is known to me as the poetic novel. For that, I am grateful to him, and have enjoyed discovering on my bookshelf and revisiting and paying tribute to his essay. Okay, now here's another conclusion, this time to this video essay, on another aspect of the writing craft. Each time I start the writing process for a new novel, I undergo a phenomenon that I would call creation shock. I experienced this phenomenon a number of times without realizing the cause. I would start a new novel and find that the dozens of questions that I would have to answer as to structure and theme and tone, in which I knew would become hundreds and even thousands of questions to answer, as the writing went on, seemed to be almost overwhelming to me. I had almost ceased to be a novelist at the time of the planning of my second novel. And I'm just going to hold it up, Jumbo. So I almost stopped being a writer because I didn't figure, I couldn't write this novel. Like, so many questions. How do you write the story of Jumbo? I just couldn't figure out how to do it. To the almost overwhelming sense of the length of the road and steepness of the hill that lay ahead of me. To write a novel, how can you do that? I recalled that such writers as Virginia Woolf and Joseph Conrad had been convinced when completing a novel writing project that they would never be able to write a novel again. Only the realization that I'd already written a novel, here it is, Grave Song, The Agony of Robert Chisholm, a novel by John Pasfield, convinced me that I was capable of writing another one. So the only evidence I had that I should go ahead and write that second novel was that I had already written one. If you can write one novel, no matter how hard it looks, no matter how impossible it looks, you can write another novel. Get busy. As time went on, what cured me of the despair that threatened to overwhelm me when I began a new writing project was the rereading of my earlier planning notebooks. It always amazes me how chaotic, mysterious, disparate, unyielding, almost impossible are the challenges that I have encountered in every one of my novel writing projects. In rereading these planning notebooks, I realized that writers suffer from what I now call creation shock, which is simply this. Anyone who's written a novel has spent the final stage of that process with a complete rough draft, about which all of the early planning questions have been answered, and about which the only question is the repeated one of how to make the wording better express the original conception of that novel. So the only question to have is this a better word? Are there better words? That's it. To come from that wonderful experience, the polishing of a complete rough draft, to the daunting experience, the need to plan and write a novel from what looks like a vast debris field of thought fragments, can be debilitating if one is not aware of it as a normal stage in a writing process. Had I not written my notebooks, one for every novel that I've written, I would never have been able to go back and review the earliest stages of creativity for each one, and I would never have been able to figure out why I was suffering from this mysterious ailment, which I came to label as creation shock. So this is my book, The Poetic Novel 1. You can't find it on Amazon or in a bookstore. It's at my website, johnpasfield.ca. Go to the icon, click on it, and you can read that book for free. So lastly, I'll say thank you for watching this video.